I kind of think about how important it is to not separate out these systems of domination, to not look at capitalism and imperialism and racism and white supremacy and feminism and or patriarchy and these we want feminism, we don't want patriarchy, to not take them apart, but to look at the sort of ways in which these systems function similarly and are mutually independent, because I think our movements will be the stronger if we're able to sort of see the commonality between our struggles, to figure out how to take leadership from the voices of those most oppressed. I mean, I think that's really what a lot of Hester's premise is about, and we're going to hear a lot about tonight. And I think that the idea of working as allies, seeing that we in different moments occupy different places on a continuum of privilege. And so figuring out how, for instance, white women can be allies to women of color and poor women and middle-class women. I think there are ways that we have, the way that men can serve as allies to feminists, and the way that white folks can be allies to people of color. I mean, these are the ways that I think our movements can grow, can become stronger. And I think the flip side of that is we will never make real progress. We won't get close to building a unified front or have really powerful mass movements if we don't see strategically and morally the sort of imperative of doing that. So without so much further ado, I will just introduce our panelists. And so Hester Eisenstein, whose book we are going to hear a lot about tonight, she's a professor of sociology at Queen's College and at the Grad Center, the CUNY Grad Center. And her previous books include Contemporary Feminist Thought, Inside Agitators, Australian Democrats and the State, and Gender Shock, Practicing Feminism on Two Continents. She's taught at Yale, Barnard, and SUNY Buffalo, and served as a Femocrat in the state government of New South Wales and Sydney, Australia. And we've got Dorotea Mendoza, who served as executive board member and secretary general from 1993 until 2008 for GABNet, a U.S.-Philippine Women's Solidarity Mass Organization. And she's now the board secretary of Bridging Assistance, Building Advocacy and Empowerment, an educational and direct service which is a direct service organization and educational institution for Filipino victims of and survivors of violence. And finally, Inestra King, who's a major spokeswoman spokesperson, if it's your preference, for ecofeminism through her activism and her writing and teaching. She's the author with Giles Silliman of Dangerous Intersection, Feminism, Population, and the Environment, and with Adrienne Harris of Rocking the Ship of State Toward a Feminist Peace Politics. And so Hester's going to talk a little bit about the book, and Dorotea and Inestra are going to do some commenting and conversation with each other. If we're lucky, Mia Herndon from the Third Wave Foundation will show up and join us.
So what I'll do is just walk you through the book and talk a little bit about what I have tried to do here. And then I'm very much looking forward to the comments of my colleagues, and then I hope we can have a general discussion. And I'll just read you the opening paragraph, which says, "It has taken me a relatively short time to write this final version of the book, but a relatively long time to overcome my dread of publishing it. As a card-carrying member of the U.S. academic feminist community, I felt that the framework of analysis that I was developing would be anathema to many, if not most, of my colleagues. Very often in the early stages of this project, I would have the following prototypical conversation with one of my colleagues. Colleague, what are you working on? Me, hesitantly. I'm working on a critique of international feminism. Colleague, rising to her full height and looking displeased. Well, I'm an international feminist. Serve, volley, net, as the Australians are wont to say. But nonetheless, I did overcome my dread, and I have published it, and I think that what I was trying to do was to place some of the troubling aspects of contemporary mainstream feminism into a historical and into an economic context. So I should mention that this book depends a lot on political economy, and so I had to learn quite a bit of economics. And I'd like to pay tribute to my husband, Mike Tanzer, who's an economist and who coached me through the painful learning process, for which I'm very grateful. So what I wanted to do was to say, well, what is globalization? And how does it have to do with women's labor? And as I plunged into the literature on globalization, I found that most of the analysis was by male economists and about a male world, and paid very little attention to what the central role has been of women in this process. So I start by really giving an overview of that, globalization and women's labor. So if I just quote Delia Aguilar, who's a very brilliant analyst of globalization and women, she says, to speak of globalization without center staging women, and particularly women of color, would be a grave mistake. In the era of globalized economics, where a race to the bottom is crucial for super profits, it is primarily the labor power of global South women that is the cheapest of all. From the maquiladoras in Mexico to assembly plants and export processing zones in Central America, the Caribbean, and the Pacific Rim, to subcontractors and garment sweatshops in global cities and in nations of the periphery, it is women's labor that allows and guarantees maximum profitability for the corporate elite, a tiny minority of the world's inhabitants, unquote. So I go on to explain what globalization means, pretty much the restructuring and transformation of the world economy from around the mid-1970s and continuing now. And you know that the financial crisis that we had that nearly sank the entire world economy was, in some sense, globalization gone mad. In other words, such an intimate interlinking of the economies of the world that when one has a sneeze, everybody else catches pneumonia. So I talk about the economic history of that, the ideological shift from Keynesianism to neoliberalism. I don't have time to really walk you through that, but that's what I do in that first chapter, and I try to make it as clear as I possibly could. And then the second chapter, I talk about the mainstreaming of feminism. That is the creation of a certain kind of, and I'm talking about a mainstream or hegemonic feminism. And if I just say Hillary Clinton or Condoleezza Rice, you know what I'm talking about. So I'm very concerned not to have my readers think that I'm trashing feminism. Au contraire, I come out of feminism. It's been my life's work. And I wrote the book because I started looking around the world and thinking, oh my God, what have they done? Meaning, how has it been seduced? And that's why I call it Feminism Seduced. How have the ideas, particularly of mainstream feminism, become extremely useful to the people who are running the planet at the moment? And the people who are running the planet, we know who they are. These are corporations, these are high government officials, these are heads of international financial institutions, and institutions such as the United Nations. And there is a very clear use being made of women and women's ideas and feminist ideology, and I'll come to that in a minute. So the first thing I lay out is how, in the myriad of campaigns and fantastic social change that happened, starting pretty much from the 1950s on, and I talk a little bit about the work of Sue Cobble, who has written a wonderful book called The Other Women's Movement. And she says, you know, most histories of the women's movement in the United States start with around the mid-1960s and the explosive growth of feminism. But she says there was another feminism that was very powerful in the 1930s and 40s and 50s, and that's labor feminism. That's the women who were active in trade unions and who first laid out the series of issues that then were picked up by the more middle-class feminism, so-called liberal feminism of the 1960s. So I talk about going from labor feminism to mainstream feminism, and what I point to is that as the second wave properly began, although it attacked every single feature of patriarchal power, so there was an incredible range of feminist campaigns, and those of us in the room who lived through this, we're dating ourselves here, from childcare to education for women to job training to ending sexual violence to opening up sexual identity and sexual liberation, lesbian, gay, and queer movements in general. The main thrust, and this in part, that's a really phallic word, isn't it? The main direction
It's okay.
of the women's movement, as shaped by capitalist powers that be, the media, the corporations, etc., was this demand for paid work. Work became the be-all and end-all of feminist liberation. So women, in effect, plunged ourselves into the capitalist economy, defining liberation as having an independent income. And when you hear my argument, I'm always speaking in some ways dialectically, because am I coming out against women getting jobs? No. But look at what happened. And I try to connect this to the developments in the Western economy, particularly the US, but this was true of Europe and is now true actually around the world, which is the decline of manufacturing, relatively, and the rise of the service industries. And the service industries is everything from teaching to healthcare to transportation to government, everything that isn't, as one of my authors says, everything that isn't something that you dig out of the ground, you know. Because anyway, I can explain that later if that's too obscure. So the rise of the service industry, the change, which was a response to declining profitability by American corporations and European and Japanese, meant that those areas where women's work was needed were expanding. And so women were being drawn in, the capitalists needed women's labor, and I talk about this as a marriage made in heaven because at the very historical moment that the capitalists said, oh my God, let's get these women into the workforce, women were saying, we want to be in the workforce, yay! And so this was extremely handy for the corporate world. So now the next chapter I talk about fault lines of race and class, and I can only kind of sketch my argument here, but I'm essentially saying that from the beginning, the issues that were put forward, and this is not a new argument, I'm really recapitulating a whole literature here. The issues that were put forward by the mainstream women's movement, by definition, because they came out of what those women were caring about, were not issues that were in the forefront of what black women needed, what Latina women needed, what Asian women needed, and certainly not what Native American women needed. Now, does that mean that they didn't need jobs? No. But the issues that concerned, for example, people in the inner cities, infant mortality, for example, police brutality, these were not issues that the middle-class women's movement defined as feminist issues. So from the beginning, you have an enormous split, which people don't like to talk about, but which is, I think, very real. And so I can't do justice to the chapter because I go back to the 19th century women's movement where the exact same thing happened, where you had an initial alliance between black and white women, which broke down when the women's movement made a sinister alliance with the southern white supremacists. So there's a history there, and you can pretty much see the same history here. And if I just mentioned a couple of issues, one is the issue about abortion, which is very hot now with this healthcare debate. And I actually heard, was it Nancy Pelosi or who was it that said on TV, smiling, you know that smile Nancy Pelosi has? Like a Cheshire cat. We have the votes, she says. She said everybody in this country agrees that there should be no federal funding for abortion. And I was like, what? You know, what? But that was what was decided in 1977 with the Hyde Amendment. You all remember this. The Hyde Amendment said, women can have the right to abortion. Yay, the Supreme Court says we can have abortions. But are we going to pay for it? I don't think so. And that is a class divide and a race divide from day one. And so that just has gone on to this day. So that's what I mean by fault lines of race and class. I can't go into more. I have other stuff in there. I have actually quite distressing discussions in here, including a section on female genital cutting, but I won't even go there, but we can do that in the discussion. Then in the 4th chapter, I really talk about the sea change that happened, and you all know the story, the change from starting with Jimmy Carter and then moving with Reagan. What Ed Herman calls what has been really a counter-revolution against the working class. I mean, there's no other word for it, smashing union power, starting with the PATCO strike, remember that? And then basically just keeping unions flat, keeping wages flat for 30 years. And how was that solved? By women going into the workforce. Again, a marriage made in heaven. Okay, so then I'm rushing through, but you guys will comment as you. Then my chapter 5 is Women in the Global South, and I talk about what happened in the period of structural adjustment from the 80s on, after the debt crisis put so many third world countries into debt, and what was done to those countries to force their borders open to international investment. And this has been written about a great deal, but all I do is focus here on the specific effects that this had on women, and they're quite horrific. I'm sure you're aware of that. And then at the end of the chapter, I talk about this concept, which I call women replacing development. And this is something that I've been tracking. If you look at ads for care, for example, do you get those little, please send money for care? And they have a beautiful third world woman in the front. And they say, how can you make her self-sufficient? Send, your $10 or whatever. And there's a whole ideology which has grown up, and here again I'm talking about using feminism. There's a whole ideology which has grown up to say, how can we fix the third world? Oh dear, what happened to the third world? They seem to be poor. Why is that? And the answer is women. That's it. Fix it up. We're going to give women education, we'll give them microcredit, we'll give them, access to high-powered jobs, and that will end poverty. And so I make the argument in the book that this is a total sleight of hand. It's a sleight of hand. It's like, it's like a shell game. Don't look here, don't look here. Mm-hmm. You cannot bring a country out of poverty by giving microcredit to 4 women. Or even 40 women, or even 400 women, okay? Stop, it's ridiculous. But it's very seductive because the World Bank now has become totally feminist, if you read this stuff. Gender and development, So that's chapter 5. Then chapter 6, I talk about, and this you alluded to, Liz Roberts, the use of women in the war on terror. I mean, this, everybody seems to, I hope everybody has noticed this, starting with Laura Bush, going on the radio and saying, the reason we're in Afghanistan is to save the women. And everybody go, wow, Laura Bush, feminist, wow. So it's astounding. But I mean, even the Times, like, when was it, 3 days ago, there's an article about the women in the Marines. Did you see that? These gorgeous young women, they're in the Marines, and they're going to Afghanistan to talk to the people. Isn't that great? They're going to go talk to people, and they said they're being trained not to be upset, like if an old, bearded tribal elder compliments them and says they're beautiful, they're supposed to not react and not say that it's sexist. I mean, it's an astounding, this is the New York Times. So again, how do we win hearts and minds, just like Vietnam, just like so many other American horrifying military adventures? Women are being drawn in to help us save the women of Afghanistan, which is, of course, our main goal, not to mention Iraq. So that's what I talk about. And I talk a little bit also about Islamophobia and how that's been just really turned into a mass hysteria in a very frightening way. And there's a little bit in that chapter about Europe, where they're now so obsessed that people like, Sarkozy of France has come out against any head covering whatsoever as anti-French. So in other words, if you show up in your hijab, you're anti-French. What is that? It's insane. But powerful,